Welcome back. This is D Average, and here's my very surface level review of Charles Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, a little under 20 years before the American Revolution. Today we're talking about aristocracies. In an aristocracy, the supreme power is lodged in the hands of a certain number of persons. These are invested both with the legislative and executive authority, and the rest of the people are, in respect to them, the same as the subjects of a monarchy in regard to the sovereign. So basically, a small group governs and makes the rules, which you can probably imagine may not be an ideal place to live. As virtue is necessary in a popular government, it is requisite also in an aristocracy. True, it is that in the latter it is not so absolutely requisite. So as just stated, only a minimal amount of virtuous behavior is needed. So let's define virtuous behavior as associated with laws to protect equality and liberty. Any system where that is minimally required seems sketchy. I think when Charles states the necessity and requisite of virtue, this is a suggestion to prolong the rule, the existence and stability of this type of government or governing behavior. So to anyone wanting to govern by this style, you still have to behave virtuously to extend your system. If you are the type of person who thinks living under an aristocracy is a good idea, well, keep in mind virtue is at the minimum. The people who, in respect to the nobility, are the same as the subjects with regard to a monarch are restrained by their laws. They have, therefore, less occasion for virtue than the people in a democracy. But how are the nobility to be restrained? They who are to execute the laws against their colleagues will immediately perceive that they are acting against themselves. Virtue is therefore necessary in this body from the very nature of the Constitution. It's a pretty thick paragraph, but let's try to break it down. The common people are restrained by laws under an aristocracy and can be labeled as acting without virtue. So if people are governed by arbitrary rules, then of course any action can be labeled as unvirtuous and illegal. The system is therefore against the people and not for them. Although the people up top will resist creating laws against themselves because they would then be limited by their system. That is why a virtuous constitution is important to protect the people. Ultimately, the people on top of whatever hierarchy, whatever aristocracy, occupying whatever position of power and influence, have that rule-making avenue to never be of the people. Moving on. An aristocratic government has an inherent vigor unknown to democracy. If the people are virtuous in an aristocracy, they enjoy very nearly the same happiness as in a popular government, and the state grows powerful. So I wanted to pull these two quotes because it touches on an important point. There's this temptation for being governed by a select group of people because things get done. Some people think that if a certain unique person or persons were put in charge, conditions or other things would improve quickly. But the condition is if the people are virtuous. So if you want this style of government to prosper, you must act virtuously. Charles argues that an aristocratic government is eventually prone to corruption and virtuous behavior that I'll get into later. The nobles form a body who, by their prerogative and for their own particular interests, restrain the people. So remember that hypocritical mantra, rules for thee, but not for me. Because during this COVID shutdown, we found the majority of business orders had to close while some didn't. So expect hypocrisy with this style of government because it is in their best interests. Now, such a body as this can restrain itself only in two ways, either by a very eminent virtue, which puts the nobility in some measure on a level with the people and may be the means of forming a great republic, or by an inferior virtue, which puts them at least upon a level with one another, and upon this their preservation depends. Moderation is therefore the very soul of this government, a moderation, I mean, founded on virtue, not that which proceeds from indolence or pusillanimity. So here Charles suggests restraint in order to preserve the aristocracy, and he suggests two methods: that the nobility honestly restrain their powers, influence, and behavior so that they're not that far above the common people. The second method is to simply moderate their own behavior, exemptions, and special treatment, or at least pretend to moderate and restrict their privileges. So if you are a person living under an aristocracy, be skeptical of this facade of moderation and restraint. If you are members of the aristocracy, well, Charles just wrote how to stay on top. You must control yourselves. It would be a very happy thing in an aristocracy if the people, in some measure, could be raised from their state of annihilation. Thus, at Genoa, the Bank of St. George, being administered by the people, gives them a certain influence in the government, whence their whole prosperity is derived. This is a good quote because it simply states the importance of influence in politics. Prosperity and government influence go hand in hand if you have a representative advocating for your interests. The senators ought by no means to have the right of naming their own members, for this would be only way to perpetuate abuses. It's straightforward. If you are a member of the aristocracy and this behavior is rampant, well then stability goes down. The best aristocracy is that in which those who have no share in the legislature are so few and inconsiderable that the governing party have no interest in oppressing them. So to anyone who desires a government with the few on top, keep your party small, and to anyone else who thinks this type of party is best, consider that you'll never climb the hierarchy to a position because there will be no room for you. Let's move on to a section of corruption. In aristocratic governments, there are two principal sources of disorder: excessive inequality between the governors and the governed, and the same inequality between the different members of the body that governs. From these two inequalities, hatreds and jealousies arise, which the laws ought ever to prevent or repress. So that's an important point, that even in aristocratic government, there will be inequalities even among the elite. So further in book 5, Charles provides two examples of inequality: marriage and money. Members of the upper classes couldn't marry down, and commoners couldn't marry up. And concerning money, Montesquieu comments on 4 examples of inequality: when the nobles don't pay taxes, have exemptions that lower classes don't have or are subjected to, use public money for themselves, and most excitingly, fraudulently create subsidies that funnel public money into their own profits. Aristocracy is corrupted if the power of the nobles becomes arbitrary. When this is the case, there can no longer be any virtue either in the governors or the governed. Something like this is obvious, old, and unoriginal. I think a good takeaway is whenever a politician such as Governor Newsom, Whitmer, or Cuomo passes some mandate, ask, is it arbitrary? What's the new rule based on? What's its point? Moving on. Great success, especially when chiefly owing to the people, intoxicates them to such a degree that it is impossible to contain them within bounds. Jealous of their magistracy, enemies to those who govern, they soon prove enemies also to the Constitution. I think he's saying that enemies of the Constitution are fueled by the fear of having their power and influence taken away, which is just a pathetic way to live. If the people are virtuous in an aristocracy, they enjoy very nearly the same happiness as in a popular government, and the state grows powerful. But as a great share of virtue is very rare when men's fortunes are so unequal, the laws must tend as much as possible to infuse a spirit of moderation and endeavor to reestablish that equality which was necessarily removed by the Constitution. The spirit of moderation is what we call virtue in an aristocracy. It supplies the place of a spirit of equality in a popular state. So if you are an aristocrat, don't go overboard with how you spoil yourself, or your system may fall. And if you are a subject in aristocracy, your fortunes and liberty will never be equal to the higher-ups. If the revenues of the state are not distributed among the people, they must be convinced at least of their being well administered. I interpret this as Charles stating another method used by aristocrats to placate the public. Other points Charles makes to the survival in aristocracy is: nobles should not be in charge of levying taxes. Nobles must be just or do justice to the people. Nobles must never adopt the grandeur or extravagances of the monarchical governments. Laws pertaining to special rights, the firstborns ought to be abolished. Nobles should be abolished from commerce. Seems a bit extreme, so that exorbitant amount of wealth aren't concentrated in them. So there you have it. This was my very surface level review of Charles Montesquieu on aristocracies, or any government where there's a few governing on top. And it's terrible because your fortunes will never be as great as theirs, and you may not have a say in the government. So thank you for listening. I'm D Average.